Good evening, welcome everybody to Time Management for Mortals. How will you use your 4,000 weeks? My name is Dr. Jane Souter and I'm going to be chairing the session today with Oliver Burkeman. I'm a researcher in work management and organisation, and I have a particular interest in workplace mental health, work-life balance and presenteeism, so I'm delighted to be able to chair this session today. A few technical notes before we begin. So if you're watching live, you can ask questions. You can just type them out in the Q&A box on your screen, and you can ask these questions throughout the talk at any time, and then I'll collect those questions and put them to Oliver after his talk. Should you have any technical issues, such as losing your Wi-Fi connection, then you can rejoin the session by using the original link that you were sent. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again on YouTube. There are also subtitles available for the event, so if you want to turn these on or off, you can use the live captioning, the CC live transcript button that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. So I would like to introduce our speaker, Oliver Burkeman. He's a journalist and the author of the excellent antidotes, The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, and also Help How to Become Slightly Happier and Get a Bit More Done. His next book, which he's going to talk about today, is called 4,000 Weeks, Time and How to Use It, and that will be published in August of this year. His writing has also appeared in The Observer, The New York Times, The New Philosopher, and Psychologies magazine. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Oliver.
It's great to be able to do this. It's a little bit weird to not be able to do it with audience feedback, so that I know if I'm holding your interest or not, but I shall do my best. It's really great as well to be doing something in York, especially because that was where I grew up and where I think I've still narrowly spent more of my time in total than I have here in New York, where I am speaking to you from. This is the first real talk I've given about this book, which is not out until August, and so I hope that I'll do my best to sort of talk about what I'm trying to get at in the book. At the very least, you'll have it kind of fresh and new from me, because I will not have gone over this sort of idea many times in speaking before. When I first realized that the average human lifespan is only about 4,000 weeks long, the first thing I did was that I started going up to various friends of mine and asking them to guess, without doing any mental arithmetic, just right off the top of their heads, how long they thought the average human in the West got to live in terms of numbers of weeks. And one friend of mine named a number in 6 figures, something like 120,000, 130,000 weeks, which kind of seems reasonable if you're not doing the maths in your head. But I had to tell her, well, I guess I didn't have to tell her, but I decided to tell her that a 6-figure number that's not really that much bigger, 310,000 weeks. That's actually the total duration of all human civilization, going back to the ancient Sumerians of Mesopotamia. I think she's still my friend, but I'm not sure. It's like human civilization has taken the blink of an eye to unfold when you look at it in those kinds of terms. There's another kind of shocking way that I really enjoy illustrating the idea of the shortness of life, not only individual human lives, but the whole of human civilization, which comes from Brian McGee, the late philosopher and TV presenter, a popularizer of philosophy. And it goes like this, right? He says, if you take any day in history, say today, somewhere today, a whole bunch of people are turning 100 and a whole bunch of people are being born. So you can sort of envisage one lifespan coming towards its end and one lifespan beginning. And if you go back from this centenarian to the time they were born in 1921, the same would have happened. There would have been somebody that day turning 100. there have been centenarians all the way through history, even though there are far more of them today. And so you can sort of envisage these 100-year-long lives as a chain through the whole of history. Now, we tend to think about human history as unfolding in these kind of glacially slow eras, right? You know, it's classical antiquity, and then it's the Dark Ages and the Renaissance, then sort of moving almost imperceptibly. But as McGee pointed out, thinking about these kind of lifetimes strung across history, 5 lifetimes ago, Henry VIII was on the throne of England. 7 lifetimes ago, the Renaissance was in its full flourishing. And about 20 lifetimes ago, Jesus was born. So that the number of lifetimes that it would actually take, conceived of like this, to span the whole of human civilization is about 60, which, as McGee pointed out, is roughly the number of people he could squeeze into his living room for a drinks party. So when you think about it in those terms, you see that, you know, the whole of humans having a civilization has been over in the blink of an eye. And so, of course, each of our own lives is the sort of tiniest flicker in the middle of in the middle of this grand sweep of empty cosmic time. So a couple of things really began to dawn on me about the implications of this, you know, in the years that I spent writing my column for The Guardian, which often looked at questions of time and productivity and work-life balance and using your life in a meaningful way and all the rest of it. One was that we should be taking time management like really seriously. And perhaps in a way, time management is all that life is. And yet that phrase, time management, it's kind of a really boring one. It kind of implies, it brings up images of sort of trying to get through as many tedious administrative work tasks as you can, or maybe of becoming, you know, the leading, the best performing salesperson in the greater Detroit area or something. Or it's, you know, how you should be cooking all your meals in one big batch on a Sunday afternoon for the week, because apparently that's the answer to work-life balance for busy parents. It's never worked for me. Indeed, the British publisher of this book, Bodley Head, I think they made the right decision when they decided not to go with the American subtitle, Time Management for Mortals, because in the British market, they thought that that would make it sound like much too much like a business book. And I think, as I say, they were right in the UK, probably. I suppose I'm lucky that anyone came to this event, since it uses the phrase. But it's really strange to me when you think about it, that this thing that really describes the main challenge of living life has been sort of bracketed away into this little subgenre. The other thing that really began to dawn on me is that when we do turn to this question of managing our time and trying to put our time to the best use, balancing work and family and leisure, all the other things, we seem to be like really bad at it. Actually, not just bad at it, but that most of the ways we try to address the challenge seem to make things worse. So we feel that we have to get more done, or we wish we were doing more meaningful things with our time, or, you know, you wish you could carve out some time for yourself amid all the obligations of family and work. And so you try, but it kind of ends up making things worse. One really interesting example of this is the way that becoming more efficient in your work in response to the pressures of life and of the economy, you know, ends up making people feel busier. It took me a very long time to realize, for example, that, you know, when I got really good at processing my email because I was feeling overwhelmed by all the emails and I wanted to receive fewer of them, or I wanted to at least to feel that I was on top of the emails I was receiving, all that happened was I just ended up getting more emails, because every time you reply to an email, you cause someone else probably to want to respond to that email. And there's a whole chain of emails come off the back of it. Whereas people who are really bad at answering emails discover something really interesting, which is that if you sort of neglect responding to people as much as you can get away with, the crisis that they were emailing you about passes, or it never materializes in the first place, or they find somebody else to answer the question that they had. And so you actually get away with being bad at responding to your email. If you get really good at it, you get more email. You get really fast and efficient at processing your work. You get more work because your boss is not stupid and they know that they want to give the work to the person who's going to process it quickly. The historian Ruth Cowan found something very similar happening with household technology. She found that when washing machines and vacuum cleaners first got adopted in the mainstream in American and in European homes, these things that were clearly meant to save time, that was their only purpose. The women who did housework ended up not spending less time on it, but in fact just as much or even more, because the standards of cleanliness that society expected and that they internalized just rose to offset the gains and the time saved. So, now that you could have rugs without the tiniest speck of dust on them, it became a sort of moral imperative that you had to do so. And finally, I think the same goes for impatience is another really good example. We invent all these things like microwaves and jet engines and the internet, and they're all supposed to save us time. And so you might assume that we'd end up feeling much more relaxed with regard to time because of all the hours that have been freed up. But instead, everybody is way more impatient these days, and it's much more frustrating to wait 10 seconds for a slow loading web page than it is like 3 days to get the same information by post. It's much more frustrating to wait 2 minutes for the microwave somehow than it is to put something in the oven and leave it there for 2 hours. If you work, or at least before the pandemic, worked in an office that has a microwave, you always have to cancel it out because it's always stuck on like 9 seconds left, because that was the moment that the person using it just ran out of patience and couldn't bring themselves to wait the whole amount of time that they'd chosen. So there's kind of a mystery here. We're living longer than ever, and we have more time-saving technologies than ever, but we seem to feel more haunted in one way or another by time than ever before. And the more we try to deal with the problem, the worse things seem to get. And this all started to get very personal for me doing the Guardian column, because it started that column, I think, eventually to function not as a way to sort of work out these ideas and come up with answers, but a bit more like I was like an alcoholic employed as a wine reviewer or something, right? It was a kind of convenient cover to enable my weird fixations. It kept me believing that I was kind of just on the verge of resolving this struggle with time, finding the technique or the approach that would resolve all my issues and make me feel at last like I was really like doing enough, that I was justifying my existence or whatever, and never ever quite getting there. Now that's only my particular set of hang-ups and neuroses, but I think that all of us, almost all of us, let's say, to one degree or another, are trying to do something similar with time. Sometimes it manifests not as trying to get through huge amounts of stuff. Sometimes it manifests as sort of wanting to live completely untroubled by the idea of having lots of stuff to do. There's all sorts of different ways that it expresses itself in people's lives, but there is this mystery about our relationship to time. And I think that most of my book is spent sort of trying to unpack that. But the core of it is that most of us spend most of our time trying to avoid confronting the fact of how limited our time is, or how little control we have over it. And that what we're usually doing when we think we're trying to sort of get our lives in order, get our time in order, do things differently, is we're trying to sort of lever ourselves into a position of dominance or mastery over our time. We're trying to feel like we're in the driving seat, that our lives are in sort of working order. And this isn't our fault, right? We live in a culture and an economy, I think, that constantly tells people they have to try to achieve this kind of dominance, be able to take care of any incoming inputs, deal with any demands that come in, and be able to sort of handle it all while also finding time for leisure and self-actualization and spending enough time with the kids and all the rest of it. And actually, I'm going to read a tiny little bit from the book where I try to sum up what I think is going on psychologically here in the relationship that most of us have with time. The truth here is that one way or another, most of us invest a lot of energy in trying to avoid fully experiencing the reality in which we find ourselves. We don't want to feel the anxiety that might arise if we were to ask ourselves whether we're on the right path, or what ideas about ourselves it could be time to give up. We don't want to risk getting hurt in relationships or failing professionally. We don't want to accept that we might never succeed in pleasing our parents or in changing certain things we don't like about ourselves. And we certainly don't want to get sick and die. The details differ from person to person, but the kernel is the same. We recoil from the notion that this is it, that this life, with all its flaws and inescapable vulnerabilities, its extreme brevity, and our limited influence over how it unfolds, is the only one we'll get a shot at. Instead, we mentally fight against the way things are. And then I'm skipping ahead. And so rather than face our limitations, we engage in avoidance strategies in an effort to carry on feeling limitless. We push ourselves harder, chasing fantasies of the perfect work-life balance, or we implement time management systems that promise to make time for everything so that tough choices won't be required. Or we procrastinate, which is another means of maintaining the feeling of omnipotent control over life, because you needn't risk the upsetting experience of failing at an intimidating project, obviously, if you never even start it. We fill our minds with busyness and distraction to numb ourselves emotionally. And this is a quote from Nietzsche. We labor at our daily work more ardently and thoughtlessly than is necessary to sustain our life, because to us it is even more necessary not to have leisure to stop and think. Haste is universal because everyone is in flight from himself. Or we plan compulsively because the alternative is to confront how little control over the future we really have. One of the really interesting, to me, things that I discovered in the course of researching this book is that there's lots of evidence that it didn't used to be this way, that most pre-industrial people didn't come close to having this sort of attitude towards time. Not just because they didn't have Twitter to distract them, or the same level of intense work demands that so many people have today, but because they didn't really think about time as an entity, as a thing that was separate from them, that they had to somehow kind of control or master at all. You should be in general very grateful that you weren't born a peasant in early medieval England. That was not a good life, and I'm not going to suggest that we return or try to return to that way of life. But they probably didn't experience time problems. They probably did not have any concept of the idea of time being moving slowly, moving too fast, trying to fit too much in, because time wasn't this kind of yardstick or conveyor belt that ran alongside life that you're constantly always trying to make sure you keep up with or make the most of. It was just, it was just the stuff that life was made of, the medium in which life unfolded. The celebrated historian E.P. Thompson showed in a famous paper that people who didn't have clocks to measure time in this way just very rarely engaged in this kind of comparative, are things going as quickly as I need them to? Have I used my day well or badly? And when they really did need to explain how long something took, they could only reach for comparisons. So they would refer to a certain thing lasting a miserere while, meaning the amount of time that it took to say, roughly the amount of time it took to say a psalm, or a pissing while, which means, well, I'll leave that to your imagination. But the point is, I think that they were sort of untroubled by time in a way that we can, in a certain way, aspire to without needing to think that we should return to their terrible, backbreaking, exploitative and hellish and disease-ridden lifestyles. And one way to do that for us as modern people is just to get better inch by inch at realizing that, there will always be more things to do that seem like you should do them than you possibly can do. There will always be more things to read than you can possibly read, more experiences to take in around the world than you could possibly hope to experience, always some social, familial obligation that you're not going to be able to meet. In short, to realize that the condition of being finite is that any decision to do anything with your time is always, by definition, a decision not to do an infinite number of other things. And that realizing this is a kind of, to live in the realization of this is to live more authentically. There are echoes here, which I explore a bit in the book, of the work of Martin Heidegger, who is problematic because on the one hand, it's extremely complicated, and I grappled terribly trying to understand what he was saying, and also because he was a Nazi, which isn't not something to recommend anybody as a time management guru or any other kind of source of wisdom. But I think that he was getting at this too, this idea that, you are never going to feel this is the advice that I think I try to convey at certain points in the book, and which, as always, I'm trying to make myself take account of as well, right? You're never going to feel like you've finally got your life into working order and that now at last you can turn to what matters. You're never going to feel like you've cleared the decks, because in a digital era, there are always going to be an infinite number of things coming back on to flood the decks. And that there's something really empowering about this, because it is the act of giving up the attempt to try to do something impossible with regard to time, something that our culture very strongly encourages us to feel like we ought to do, to, live self-actualized lives, or even just to be able to keep a roof over our heads. But, if it's impossible, it's impossible. And so the first step here is in sort of understanding that and freeing yourself up, empowering yourself to focus more calmly on doing what is actually possible. So I think of this book as sort of an invitation to ask, what if you stop trying to clear the decks before getting down to your most important work? You just allowed yourself to feel the discomfort of knowing that, the decks are never going to be clear. And instead, you're just going to have to make a bit of time now to focus on the most important stuff, knowing that everything else is accumulating on your to-do list inevitably while you do it. What if you stopped trying to multitask and started trying to do one thing at a time in sequence? Because you would see that mostly multitasking isn't really about getting things done any faster. It's actually about maintaining this illusion that you're not constrained by the limitations of time, that you don't need to make any tough choices, that nothing needs to wait to get done, and you can sort of do it all at once now. What if instead of constantly fretting about how the future was going to unfold, you could see, in the words of Joseph Goldstein, the American meditation teacher, that a plan is just a thought, right? A plan is always only something in the present moment arising in your head now. The future is always completely unknown, regardless of whether you make yourself miserable worrying about that fact in the present now or not. And also, what if you let go of the fear of missing out, which everyone talks a lot about these days, now that we're connected digitally to so many potential opportunities for things we want to do or that we ought to be doing? What if you saw instead that there's a kind of joy in missing out, right? There's something. If you decide to do one thing, if I decide to, do bath time and bedtime with our 4-year-old son, there's a kind of affirmation precisely in the fact that there are 100 other things I could do and I'm not doing in order to do that, because the condition of only having so much time is such that, to make that choice, you really have to decide that it's more important than anything else you could be doing. Near the beginning of the book, I sort of sum all this up like this, and I'll just end on this quote to sort of set up the conversation with Jane and with you all after that. I write, 4,000 Weeks is yet another book about making the best use of time, but it's written in the belief that time management as we know it has failed miserably, and that we need to stop pretending otherwise. This strange post-pandemic moment in history, when time feels so unmoored, might in fact provide the ideal opportunity to reconsider our relationship with it. Older thinkers have faced these challenges before us, and when their wisdom is applied to the present day, certain truths grow more clearly apparent. Productivity is a trap. Becoming more efficient just makes you feel more rushed and also lonelier, as we'll see. Trying to clear the decks simply makes them fill up again faster. Nobody in the history of humanity has ever achieved work-life balance, whatever that might be. And you certainly won't get there by copying the, quote, 6 things successful people do before 7:00 a.m. The day will never arrive when you finally have everything under control, when the flood of emails has been contained, when your to-do lists have stopped getting longer, when you're meeting all your obligations at work and in your home life, when nobody's angry with you for missing a deadline or dropping a ball, and when the fully optimized person you've become can turn at long last to the things life is really supposed to be about. Let's start by admitting defeat. None of this is ever going to happen. But you know what? That's excellent news. So I'll be happy to answer questions and talk about it more.
Thank you very much, Oliver. That was really fascinating, and we've got quite a few questions that have come in from the audience, but I think I'd like to kick off with a question first, though, before we get to that, and that's around the idea of guilt. So the argument you present in your book, it's kind of around how the source of anxiety often stems about worrying about the future, and a future that you can't control, and kind of letting go of your guilt over the things that you can't get done. So would you say you've reached that yourself yet? And have you got any tips on how we ourselves can let go of our guilt over not getting everything done?
Have I reached it myself? I don't know. I feel like that my claim to know what I'm talking about in writing this book is as a result of like being especially bad at all these things, and thus having been sort of obliged to think about them and indeed sort of half build a career around working them out. So I think I have got like wisdom to share, but it's wisdom from struggling more rather than less. I think that a lot of this is to do with sort of living it day to day. And in a conversation like this, we're obviously just talking about the ideas behind it. But I think that there is something really, really powerful just in seeing that the thing you're trying to do, in other words, the amount of tasks that you're setting as the standard that would make you not feel guilty, or the number of roles you're trying to excel in your life that would count for you as doing enough. For a lot of people anyway, and certainly for me, and sometimes it's like it's impossible in the sense of that it's impossible for 2 + 2 to add up to 5, right? It's kind of logically impossible. It's structurally impossible. It isn't that you haven't found the right time management technique yet, or that you haven't applied enough self-discipline. It is that the thing you're trying to do is you're beating yourself up effectively for not being able to, jump 3 miles in the air, right? It's just a thing that is not within the human gift. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that it's not just that like someone who thinks that has made a dumb mistake, that we live in a world that completely reinforces this message, and there are plenty of the least privileged people for whom failing to do the impossible might mean getting evicted, not being able to feed your family. But here's the thing: if the demand is impossible, it's still impossible, and it's impossible at every step of the ladder. And we've created this really strange situation where if you've got no money and no sort of social privilege, you're asked to do all sorts of impossible things just to stay afloat. But if you are much more sort of outwardly successful and you have a sort of good job, and what happens in the culture is that you then feel that now there's a new kind of impossibility. You've got people who with the best jobs today are as busy, or the best paid jobs are as busy as people lower down the ladder, even though the whole point of being rich through history was so that you could go hunting for deer and not have to work. And so we're sort of systematically exposed to all these other new things that we feel like we must be doing in order to live a life of fulfillment. So I think seeing that it's a rigged game is incredibly important as a first step, because it's much harder to feel guilty about doing something that you really understand it is in fact not possible to do.
Thank you, Oliver. I'll try and get rid of some of my guilt.
There's a quote. Sorry, just to interrupt back in. There's a quote at the beginning. I use at the beginning of the book from the Zen teacher Charlotte Jocko Beck, which is, "What makes it unbearable is your mistaken belief that it can be cured," which is one of those quotes that I think about like over and over again. It's like the big part of the suffering and stress of this is the idea that you ought to be able to make it be otherwise. And I think that's just hugely empowering to realize, to see through that a little bit.
Yeah, that we don't actually have control over these things sometimes. Yeah, I agree with that. So the first question we have here from the audience is from Jed Mears, who asks, he says he's a big fan of your books, and he's delighted you're here to speak with us. And he was wondering if you could say a bit more about what you think the appeal of procrastination might be. So especially when our time is finite, So you mentioned avoiding the risk of failure, but could it also be that it does so much of the heavy lifting on how best to spend your time if you put things off for so long? So what the best use of your time becomes dictated by your circumstances.
Right, because you're on deadline, and then you've got no choice. I think it's a really interesting thought, and I'm sure that I spent a lot of years until fairly recently working in a sort of completely deadline-driven environment, which was good for me in certain ways, but I think it definitely sort of allows you to. I think what you're doing there, and it's part of the same dynamic, I think, that I was talking about, is you're sort of you don't have to take responsibility for how you're using your brief slice of life, because it seems non-negotiable once the bill is due today, once the editor is like yelling at you for not having submitted the article yet. It seems like this kind of crazy responsibility of trying to, of consciously choosing, using whatever agency you have to build a life is just taken away from you. It's like a sort of very sort of childlike situation then. And I was definitely conscious at earlier stages in my career of sort of slotting editors into sort of parent roles in my head. They just told me what to do and I had to do it. It was kind of annoying, and I got mad with them like teenagers get mad with their parents, but it did sort of, it did make things simple in a way. I think the other thing about procrastination that's just worth saying is that it is a kind of exerting control over the world, right? It's a kind of a self-defeating one, because you don't spend your time on the things that you want to do, but you get to sort of preserve the fantasy that when you do finally decide to initiate the thing, then it's going to be perfect. I write a little bit about in the book about the work of the philosopher Oliver Burkeman, who sort of talks about how it's always more fun to fantasize about the future than to sort of do things in the present, because in the fantasy of the future there aren't these limits. You can say, like, in a few months or years, I'm going to figure out how to spend like all my time being brilliant at this and all my time doing this and all my time doing that. And you never have to like make any choices. But in the present, you always have to let something go to spend an hour on anything else. So he talks about the way the future is pregnant with an infinity of possibility or something like that. And it really sucks, to have to instead decide what you're going to neglect in order to do things. So I think that's another reason that procrastination is very alluring, because you're sort of living in this imaginary time of future omnipotence instead of present day limitation.
I think that quite nicely leads on to, I think it's quite a good question here. It's about what do you think managers will think about this approach to time management? Is this really a manifesto for slackers?
I don't think it's a manifesto for slackers. I think I think that it's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about it in that sort of adversarial way so much, sort of managers versus employees. I think that one of the things that I write about, which is absolutely, I think, is a problem in organizational settings, is this general idea of the efficiency trap. I mentioned it a little bit in the talk. The idea that getting really good at dealing with email just invites more email because the inputs are infinite. Effectively, there's no limit to the number of emails you could receive, number of demands your boss could make, number of articles that might be useful for you to read for your work. But you're limited. Your time is finite, your stamina is finite. So if you get better at processing them, it's just like getting faster at climbing an infinitely tall ladder, right? You get faster and you feel more rushed, but you're never going to get to the top. It's the modern day myth of Sisyphus, right? That you empty your emails and then it's like, oh, you have new messages. So you start emptying your emails again, blah, blah, blah. And I think that I'm sure, and I know from personal experience, that this kind of effect, it's related to like Parkinson's law, right? It's not completely brand new. It's just really hypercharged in the world we live in now. I think that this is a real negative from a manager's point of view who wants, to get the most out of the people they work with, because it leads to this confusion between being sort of really efficient and ever getting around to the things that matter the most, whether that's matter the most personally or matter the most organizationally. I write in the book, I became incredibly aware a few years ago that I was getting really good at getting things done, but it was systematically the unimportant things that I was good at getting done. And you would sort of endlessly postpone the things that really mattered because you would tell yourself you needed all the time and attention, you needed all the other little stuff to be out of the way. And so precisely by trying to sort of be very dutiful and a good worker or whatever, I was sort of systematically never getting around to the things that mattered the most. So no, I think it's a healthy appreciation of what it means to live in some consciousness of finitude is it's going to help everybody ultimately. It might cause people to decide they want to leave their jobs, but I can't object to that if that's the conclusion they come to.
I think that also links in quite nicely to this next question, which is about, do you have any experience of or advice for staying aware of this empowerment and joy in choosing to deliberately ignore things on your items on your to-do list?
I don't quite get the question, but if it's about sort of practical techniques and things like that, I go into that in much more detail in the book. But one that really made a big difference to me was this idea of limiting your work in progress, which comes from an approach that some people will know about from software design and other kinds of contexts like that, called Kanban. Japanese inspired approach. But what it comes down to, I won't go into details. The basic idea is that, a way of organizing your sort of the projects that you're focused on in your work, if you have this kind of control of your daily schedule, is to sort of define a very small number of tasks that you're going to allow to be sort of on your plate right now, maybe 3, and not to put any more onto your plate until you have completed one of those 3 and it's moved off and left a space. And so you're sort of very methodically starting something, maybe 2 things, finishing them before starting the next thing. It has a really strangely powerful effect because it brings you into direct confrontation with how limited your time is, right? It makes you see that I think a lot of people in sort of white collar, so-called knowledge work jobs spend their days kind of sort of just touching 30 of the things that they're working on, but not really making any progress on any of them in order to feel like they're on top of things and they're in control. If you do this, it really sort of forces you to neglect things which you were doing anyway, right? That's the thing. It's not like you're not going to become worse at things. You were already neglecting things, but it forces you to become conscious of what you're neglecting, and then gradually to sort of begin this production line of not neglecting them, of finishing them and moving them along. And that has made a very big difference to how I work, and was actually critical to finally getting this book finished after a big pause a year or so ago. And because you sort of, it makes you see that you are always neglecting things, whatever you do, but by doing it consciously, I think it's much more there's much more peace of mind about that, and you can just focus on doing things. One more that springs to mind, which I mentioned in the book, is this idea of deciding in advance what to fail at. This idea of sort of either on a permanent basis, just saying, look, I'm not going to be the kind of person who has a tidy house because these other things are more important. And then you've sort of decided it in advance, and you're not going to feel so guilty if it's not something that you manage to do. Or even on a sort of seasonal basis, saying the next 3 months, I'm really going to go all in on work, and I'm probably going to neglect my friends, but it's okay because in 3 months' time, I'm going to switch into a mode where I'm really trying to see more of my friends and do a much more modest amount, that I can get away with at work. It doesn't work for everything. You can't stop making the kids pack lunch for preschool for 3 months and then do it again for 3 months. Although, with negotiations with the spouse, maybe you could, but it's just a way of sort of confronting head on the fact that these standards tend to be impossible, and sort of strategically deciding that you're going to sort of go with that in certain ways instead of keep running into it and feeling bad as a result.
Because I'd say your book, it kind of sets it up as you've only got 4,000 weeks to live, and it's a finite amount of time, and that sort of it on the face of it seems like that's quite a depressing message. But actually, the book it's actually quite a positive book, and it's empowering because it's about, you need to let go of these, understand these things, understand what you're going to fail at, and I think that kind of can release you, can't it?
I really hope it's empowering. I mean, obviously the risk here is that people see this title, figure out what it means, and just want absolutely nothing to do with this book because it's too scary. But I don't, I certainly don't claim to be perfectly at peace with the facts of mortality or anything like that. I think that the point is that, it's sort of scary to confront these truths, but to the degree that you can confront them, to that same degree, they're no longer, you no longer have to invest energy in avoiding feeling the emotions that go along with them, and you can focus instead on actually spending your time doing a few things that really count. So it's the opposite of right. It's not despairing. It's the opposite of despair. It's the beginning of turning towards that which is actually possible.
Yeah, well, that's certainly what I took from the book. So we just change direction a bit. Now we've got a couple of questions here which relate to technology. So Steve asked whether you would agree whether the computer is the greatest enemy of effective time management, and Alice has also asked whether you think social media and the internet has influenced our attitude to time, and in particular the idea of spending our time well.
Yeah, I mean, it goes both ways, right? I think you can definitely turn this idea of using time well into a new source of guilt. And you can see that, you can tell yourself that 5 minutes spent on social media is so terrible that, you just end up feeling worse because you succumbed to that. I mean, whether the computer is the biggest enemy, I think that sort of underlying point here about all of this is that the thing that really interests me is the sort of the phenomenology of being online, right? Not the way it feels to be online. There's something about the world of cyberspace that really does feel, infinite. It does feel like limits don't apply. It feels like you can present yourself as whoever you want. You can know instantaneously what's happening 3,000 miles away. It also, it seems like you're connected to a sort of infinite fire hose of information. So it's very appealing to people, namely all of us, who don't want to experience being limited and finite. It feels very sort of freeing to sort of jump into that infinite swimming pool instead. And I think that is a big part. I write in the book a whole chunk about distraction. I think something we really don't see, or not enough people see, about digital distraction is, yes, it is all these platforms and, wily technologists developing persuasive technologies and algorithms to keep us hooked. But it's also we are collaborators with this situation as well, because it feels uncomfortable to stay focused on things that matter to you, right? I mean, the reason that when I'm writing something that's hard to write, I'd rather just go to Twitter is because the writing brings me into contact with my limitations. I have to worry that maybe it's not going to be a success. I have to do that sort of, have that experience of difficulty of working out how something should be phrased. And it's just all of that, it vanishes into this kind of infinite world online. And it's another example I just give just quickly in the book is, we talk about distraction as if the reason that you're not focused on an important conversation with your spouse at the dinner table is because you're checking your phone, reading the news underneath the table instead. But it's the other way around. Checking the news on your phone is the thing that you do because the conversation feels difficult, or because it feels out of your control, because you don't know where it's going to lead. So yes, Twitter and Facebook are there at the ready to mercilessly exploit us and to monetize our attention once we've felt that discomfort. But the discomfort comes from just sort of the confrontation with limitation. I work here in Brooklyn and hear like the insane drivers honking their horns in the street because they think they ought to be able to make the world go at a certain pace, and they can't, and it's really annoying, and there's nothing else to do in a car but just sort of emit a howl. And I think that's the same thing. It's the same basic sort of refusal of the fact that stuff just can feel difficult, especially meaningful and important stuff.
So changing the topic slightly now, I don't think we can get through this talk without talking about the pandemic. And Mary here has asked, what do you think the impact of the pandemic has had on our time and our attitude to how we can rather than should spend our time? So I know you've written about this in the book. I think it's one of my favourite bits about the great pause and how we reassessed our relationship with time. But also you talked about the right to be lazy. And I think with the pandemic and a lockdown, it kind of forced us all to have more time at home because we couldn't go out. So we had this enforced right to be lazy.
I mean, it was really fascinating, and it has been really fascinating because all sorts of people have reported, that their kind of experience of time just sort of collapsed, that it seemed to be dragging very slowly, but also racing by sometimes, kind of at the same time. You lose all those temporal landmarks of sort of ordinary routines. At the same time, I kept reading articles about how we were experiencing the lockdown, and it would be like, if it was written by a 25-year-old journalist who was single and didn't have kids, the story would be that it was just, there were these kind of vast stretches of emptiness, and what did you do? And then for anyone with small children like us, it was just like, this was just like, what are you saying? It's like suddenly we have no time. We have no school, no childcare. We're trying to sort of grab little 2-hour chunks of work while the other partner does 2-hour chunks of looking out. So the time was distributed very unequally, and also not along standard socioeconomic lines, because if you were kicked out of a job as a result of the pandemic, as many people were here, or even or furloughed or whatever, then you had maybe too much time. If you and then people who were lucky enough to have sources of employment found themselves with just overstretched to an insane degree. So I think it was very telling in that regard. But I also think it's a kind of this is the thing you're talking about in the book. I talk about how it's having a stoppage like that enforced on a whole civilization or on whole countries is a really interesting opportunity to, as somebody I quote in there puts it, to Marie Kondo it all when it comes to our use of time, to decide which of the things that we do with our time really spark joy or that are truly indispensable to our sort of getting by, and which of them aren't. I think lots of people, to speak to your interest in presenteeism, lots of people have experienced this as a much more effective way of working, because they realize that, a lot of what they do in an office job is performance or is commuting in a way that they don't want to do. And certainly there are all those boundary issues about trying to work at home, especially if the kids are off school, as they have been until fairly recently in most of the, many places. But there is also this kind of sudden removal of all the things like, people talking in rapturous terms about no longer having to work in open plan offices, and they can actually have thoughts that contribute to their fulfillment and their employer's bottom line, because they're not in that kind of environment anymore. So I think it's a really interesting opportunity to sort of ask, amid all the terrible awfulness of the last year and a half, what has been good about it, and what could you find a way to keep a bit of during the Great Return. I ended up spending far more time outdoors and in nature, partly because of different regulations here than there, but far more time outdoors than in a regular year. I'm already looking with disappointment at the fact that I won't be able to persuade my less cold-loving friends to come out for like picnics in the evening in the middle of November, which I thought was really fun. But there's lots of opportunities to sort of ask, what was it that, of these things that you didn't choose, which ones of them might you keep going forward if you could?
What kind of lessons do you think we might forget from the pandemic? So, there's lots of people have sort of reevaluated their relationship with time, and I think we've sort of prioritized what's important to us more. It's kind of made us realize that. But do you think we'll go forward with those lessons, or do you think we might forget some of these things?
Oh, I mean, I think everything in our psychologies is structured to forget it, right? Because anything you see as in that sort of fresh way with fresh eyes, you're like, for all sorts of reasons, your whole sort of psychological functioning is focused on trying to make that routine and automatic, and forget that it's there, because we just don't have the mental capacities to be treating every incoming bit of data as new. So yeah, that's the struggle. But again, I think it would be a question of setting the boundaries, the expectations low. It's not that it's not necessarily that you're going to spend hours and hours, you're going to be in a position to spend hours and hours doing whatever it was that you found valuable in this time, but that you might find a little portion of more in life than before. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole challenge. And hopefully, one of the things of putting some of that into a book is that it acts as a little sort of I don't know what the metaphor is, but it acts as a sort of way of sort of holding open those thoughts a little bit longer, so that people have a chance to sort of live in the perspective shift for a little bit longer, and then you have to sort of implement things in your life to try to make it a reality.
So in your book, you talk about you like walking in the Yorkshire Dales, I think you wrote about. So we've got a question here saying, going back to what you said about people in the past not experiencing this problem of time, to what extent do you think being closer to nature plays a role in that? And Ed goes on to say, I'm sure many people would agree that we feel much less stressed about what we should be doing when we're out and about in nature and away from man-made destruction.
Yeah. Time in nature is just this kind of amazing combination of like 5 or 6 different things that we could all do with more of in our lives. And it's kind of, I think the main thing to stress is just how, and this is now kind of fairly established research finding, I think, how little makes a difference, right? I mean, if you live 5 minutes in a park in the middle of the day has been shown to have to make a difference to mental health, let alone being able to spend, multiple hours in the week doing things like hiking in the Yorkshire Dales. So, I mean, one of the things where that comes up in the book is I'm talking about the work of a philosopher called Kiran Setia about how important it is to have things you do in your life that you're not doing in order to reach a goal with them, and how for me and lots of people, I think, country walking can be an example of that, because it doesn't, if you want to achieve the goal of a country walk, which is to get back to wherever you parked your car, you should just not go on the walk at all. And it makes it very vivid that there is this kind of I mean, maybe some people do it to keep their heart healthy or whatever, but the main reason to do it is itself. And then I go on to a long thing about hobbies, and which sort of fulfill that same category. The other thing that's been found that's really interesting to me about nature in the context of limitation, although this question has made me think about it and it's not actually in the book, is that in any sort of fairly sweeping natural landscape, you really do have a sense of your own relative smallness in a way that you don't in a sort of at a desk or in a cubicle or in a home office or something. And there is something, I think, there's something very relieving about that sort of re-establishment of some sense of how little you can control. You know, you don't walk through a huge wilderness landscape, of which there are some amazing ones here in the US. You don't walk through that with any sense that you ought to be able to determine anything about it, or the weather patterns, or, you know, over here, whether there might be grizzly bears hiding around the next rock. And there is something that people experience, as you can see by how popular that is, you know, as incredibly liberating, because it is the sort of, you're no longer caught in this kind of illusion that you're about to sort of achieve total control over what happens, or make your environment exactly perfect, because it's so obviously outside your control. And that, I think, is generally is really, people experience that as really liberating and fulfilling.
And it's, I think, on that note, and looking at the time, we're going to have to stop, but great to finish on a positive. I'd like to thank you very, very much, Oliver, for joining us here for the Festival of Ideas. It's been absolutely fascinating. For the audience, the recording of this event will actually be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website after the 20th of June. And you'll be also contacted by email if you'd like to see that. Also, I'm going to do a little plug of your book. Just looks like it's on backwards, but 4,000 Weeks, it's an absolutely fascinating read. I was very lucky to be posted an early copy of this through my door, so thank you for that. And do order it from Fox Lane Books. I think it's up in the chat for everybody. And for more information on book sales, you can also visit the festival website or head direct to foxlanebooks.co.uk/Festival of Ideas. And I think, Oliver, it's really important we get some pre-orders in as well, don't we? So
well, that makes a huge difference. Yeah. If there's any chance that you might buy it prior to its publication, please do that. That's a huge gift to authors in terms of getting a book started. And thank you anyway for listening and being here and everything. It's been really fun.
And one last thing from me, we very much hope that you'll, as the audience, that you'll continue to engage with the York Festival of Ideas. So if you check out the website, yorkfestivalofideas.com, for the full details of all the events in the festival programme. And we'd also love to hear your thoughts on these events, and also on Oliver's talk today, if you use the hashtag on Twitter of ideas. So thank you again, Oliver.
Thank you.